It's such a pleasure to be here with you and with these four distinguished panelists, each of which is a specialist very accomplished in his or her own field. And they represent a spectrum of the arts. The point of departure for this session, as I understand it, was Gil Shaham's realization that in the 1930s there was a striking profusion of masterpieces in the genre of the violin concerto. And so he began thinking about this. And I'd like to do the following in this session. First, have Gil tell his story about this discovery or realization, and then go through our four panelists, and each of them will talk about a different field of the arts. Alan will talk about music, Richard about architecture, I believe, and then Heidi will talk about the fine arts, and try to get some sense of something about what the 1930s was. And at the conclusion of that, we'll discuss among ourselves some of the points that we've raised, and then open it up to a discussion with you about music and arts in the 30s and the relationship to the world today. So why don't we begin with Gil? Tell us what happened. How did you come upon this realization?
Well, I feel like I should begin by apologizing. I feel like it's mostly my fault that we're all here today on a beautiful Aspen day. As Graeme mentioned, the 1930s was a kind of violinist's gold mine, you know. I didn't think about the 30s until the year 2000, when I guess I tried to get a handle on the 20th century in music and everything that happened in music, unsuccessfully, I might add. And I realized that there was a spike in my favorites in the 30s. And putting my personal preferences aside, it's a pretty astounding list of composers that wrote for the violin at the time. When I read this list to a friend, he said, "Well, Gil, you've just named all the great composers of the last 100 years," and it's almost true. Bela Bartok, Igor Stravinsky, Sergei Prokofiev, Alban Berg, Arnold Schoenberg, Roger Sessions, Samuel Barber, William Walton, Benjamin Britten, Darius Milhaud, Paul Hindemith, and I'm leaving out many, Karl Szymanowski, Karl Amadeus Hartmann, Ernst Bloch, all wrote violin concertos at the same time. And this is a curious coincidence because there was no governmental decree saying composers must write for the violin, you know? There was no easy explanation. If anything, the violin concerto had gone out of fashion. It wasn't in vogue before these composers. Ravel, Debussy, Gershwin never wrote a violin concerto. And I thought this was thought-provoking, and decided to start studying the scores and start performing these pieces and start listening to people's reactions. Another friend to whom I read the list, musicologist and writer by the name of Jessica Duchin, when she heard the list, she said, "Well, Gil, these are certainly the most iconic works." And I liked that word. I liked iconic because it was apt. It fitted these particular pieces. I think that word can be overused, especially in the arts. But with these works, you know, they are symbolic of the time. They are emblematic of the author's voices and styles and techniques. And they are kind of a point of departure. You could start a sentence by saying, violin concertos up until Bartok's second. Or you could start a sentence by saying, violin concertos after Alban Berg's. So I became a little more sensitive to the word iconic. And I guess I was reading an article, kind of a light article, my favorite kind of reading, entitled, "Film Historians Rate the 100 Greatest Films Ever Made," you know. And I came across this sentence, and I'm paraphrasing, but it said something like, "Experts unanimously agree that 1939 was the greatest year in Hollywood history, producing such iconic pictures as Gone with the Wind and Wizard of Oz. And I thought, well, there's that word again, you know. I was telling some of you when we were on the phone, I was listening to a clip of experimental composer by the name of Raymond Scotty playing his most famous tune, which you all probably know, Powerhouse. It's and the little blurb next to the clip read, Raymond Scotty performing his iconic 1937 Powerhouse. And I thought, okay, well, here's that word again. And anyway, at this point, I went straight to Google, and I typed in 1930s and icons. And of course, there were many hits. But I thought that they were thought-provoking. There was the Golden Gate Bridge, and the Sheol Hammett, and there was the Empire State Building, and King Kong, and there was Ernest Hemingway, and John Steinbeck, and Brave New World, and Picasso's Guernica, and Salvador Dali, and American Gothic, and Shirley Temple, and I'm trying to remember that, Porgy and Bess. There were so many. Our national anthem was written 100 years before, but became, by governmental decree, our national anthem in 1931. And I've been going back and forth. I didn't know if I should mention Joe DiMaggio and the 1939 Yankees, 1938 Yankees, 37, 36, 32. Anyway, at this point, I was way out of my depth, and I went back to playing violin concertos. And after Stravinsky, a very eloquent patron of the National Symphony came backstage, and he asked me a question. He said, Gil, at the time when Stravinsky was writing this piece, people were living through a unique time in history. I'm paraphrasing, but he said the 1930s was a period of adversity, and people lived with tumult and trepidation, and the feeling was as if on the edge of a volcano, waiting for the eruption. How was this reflected in the music of the day? How does this relate to our times? And how does this relate to the music of today? And I don't know the answer, but I thought it would be worthy of a discussion, and so I'm thrilled to be here today with you and with this distinguished panel. And I'm going to stop talking now.
Gil? Do you want to play a little bit of something just to get to whet the appetite for the discussion?
Sure.
Yeah. We had the Berg chorale, which you had suggested from the violin concerto, the Stravinsky, Barber. Let's just choose one for the sake of time. We can come back and play some others.
Would you like to start with the Berg, maybe?
Yeah, that sounds great.
The Berg Violin Concerto is an incredible piece that is actually directly related to Walter Gropius. It was the death of his daughter, Manon. She was the daughter of Walter Gropius and Alma Mahler. And she was the apple of Vienna's eye, kind of the second coming of Alma. And she was taken by polio. And this was the final straw, what finally persuaded Alban Berg to write this violin concerto that the violinist Louis Krasner had been pestering him to write. And the concerto is in two parts. The first part depicts her life. The second part begins by describing her death in a very operatic, dramatic fashion. Describes her death struggle and death throes. And then the second half of this second part is a very touching, I guess it's the idea is her transcendence. And it's a very famous passage in which he uses a melody from a Bach chorale called Es ist genug. It's, it is enough, Lord, I'm ready for you to take me. It's from the cantata number 60, Ewigkeit, du Donnerswort, eternity, you word of thunder. And what happens is the violin plays this melody with Berg's own 12-tone harmonization, very poignant, very dissonant, and this sort of weeping violin. And then it's immediately contrasted with Bach's original, in Bach's language, with a group of clarinets, which really sounds like an organ, from a faraway, village. And there's something about this passage that I feel is a metaphor for the whole time, because it does have in it, this longing for the old world and this anxiety about the new world and where are we going. And I talk too much.
No.
Let's play music.
Alban Berg's Violin Concerto, the chorale passage. Astonishing passage in music. Alan, do you want to talk a little bit about what you think about the 30s in music, or
yes, what
some
I think.
aspect of it?
So Gil got the fun part, and I got the sort of speculative, likely to be completely wrong part. But what we talked about is why would it happen that during about an 8-year period, virtually every major living composer wrote a violin concerto, and not before those 8 years and not so much after either. And I know Sibelius, big exception, just forget about Sibelius for right now. So I want to go to a literary theorist, Helen Wendler, and this is from an essay in which she's talking about the 30s, primarily in modernism in literature, so Yeats, Pound, Eliot, Wallace Stevens, Carlos Williams. She borrows a phrase from Eliot's Four Quartets. The Four Quartets were actually published in the early 40s, but mostly composed in the 30s, except for the phrase she borrows, because Eliot talks about the years of entre-deux-guerres, and he's describing them as a wasted period, as a matter of fact. But this now is Helen Wendler. The years of entre-deux-guerres began with the post-war disillusion, the sense of myriads of lives sacrificed for a botched civilization, an enormous waste, and with the desolation of a ruined Europe, which its first readers found embodied in the wasteland. To the historians, it is a gloomy period. It was at the same time one of the great creative periods in all the arts, as it was in science, an age of giants. Then she talks about the sense of revolution and that the modernists in the 30s were extremely conscious that they were participating in an artistic revolution. Just like all revolutions, it had appealed back from an immediate and what was seen as a discredited past to a true tradition which it declared had been revived. So the 30s is also in music the great flowering of neoclassicism. So neoclassicism would be the clearest example of this. Composers seeing the Romantic era as discredited and searching for a replacement, but in some cases searching through the avant-garde for a replacement, so something totally new, totally different. And those people were typically creating new forms and were not writing for traditional ensembles. However, a different segment of composers, including most of the ones that Gil mentions, said, no, let's go back further in the past. And so they were looking at the classical era, at Mozart, at Haydn, looking for a sense of balance, of proportion, which they felt the Romantic era had lost, or even all the way back to the Baroque era, as Alban Berg did. I'd like to note that people think of Schoenberg as an avant-garde figure, but he was appalled whenever anyone said that, because he thought he represented the truest aspect of a great tradition that had lost its way, primarily after Beethoven. And he was one of the great scholars of Beethoven's theory. So, the replacement of an overblown romanticism, modernism in music, reaches a real peak in the 30s. And now I want to introduce a very speculative idea just for us to think about and perhaps discard. But this is why the violin concerto. First of all, it presents itself as an extremely traditional form. And so if you are writing a piece for sirens, wind machines, and 4 pianos, this is presenting itself as an avant-garde piece in the concert. But if you go into the hall and you see a symphony orchestra and you see Gil Shaham come out onto the stage, or let's say Jascha Heifetz, the Gil Shaham of the 30s, yes, then you are in the realm of a tradition. And this was an explicit choice of all of these composers, is to situate themselves in that tradition. But I'd like you to think a little about the particular rhetoric, the rhetoric of the violin concerto. On my way over here, I bumped into Vladimir Feltzman, the great pianist, and you'll hear him on Sunday afternoon. And I said, I'm going to talk about the fact that piano concertos are noisy and violent violin concertos are beautiful. And he said, absolutely yes. He said, let me go practice more in order to be noisier. But seriously, the piano concerto is a rhetoric of opposition. The piano is unlike the orchestra, and yet it equals the orchestra. It has the same range as the orchestra. It is able to make a comparable amount of sound to the orchestra. By contrast, the violin is a member of the orchestra. It's very sound, makes it part of the ensemble, and yet not seeing any other kinds of players here, I will venture to say, the violin is able to speak to the orchestra in a way that virtually no other orchestral instrument is. If you're writing a cello concerto, you have to face the problem that without extreme care, the cello is going to disappear. And to be a little fanciful, most cello concertos, to me, have this sense of struggle, of the voice of the cello is struggling to assert itself, not so much the violin. So the violin has the ability to embody a sense of self in the orchestra, but also to lead, to have a rhetoric of persuasion rather than of opposition. And so I'm going to suggest that this was a rhetoric that these composers wanted and needed in the period of the 30s, and that they wanted to appeal to tradition, and they wanted to as I say, situate themselves back into a time when there was balance and when there was the possibility of positive argument and not just noisy opposition. So that's my overall thought. Why did all these violin concertos happen in the 30s?
Beautiful. Very nice, Alan.
Well, I thought I'd just jump in really quick and say that 1 minute later from where we stopped the clip, there is a unique passage. I don't know of any other work that does this, where the violin soloist, and this, I don't know if this is more of a visual gesture. The violin soloist is joined one by one. This is in the Berg, by each violinist in the orchestra. And he sort of leads the entire violin section. And then one by one, each violinist drops out until you are left with the one voice. And I think, yeah, I think...
It's the perfect example. May I say, by the way, and putting my impresario hat on, Gil will be playing 4 of these concertos this summer. It's a unique opportunity, beginning next Wednesday with the William Walton Concerto. But look on your Aspen Music Festival calendars.
Thank you, Alan. Very interesting take and creative thought about the violin concerto in the 30s. But now we're going to turn to leave music, as it were, to talk about other dimensions of art, where things can look so completely different. So, Richard Olcott, would you like to pick up the thread a little bit?
You know, it's really, this is a most fascinating topic. I think when Gil first floated this idea to us, I thought to myself, that is going to take some real sleuthing, because I couldn't immediately say, oh, of course the 30s, they represent some incredible flowering of architecture, because they don't, really. It's actually a very, very different scenario. And that's probably because architecture is literally concrete, a real thing that is supposed to have a useful, practical purpose. And more importantly, it takes other people's money to make it. And there isn't, you find, a lot of other people's money floating around in the 30s. In fact, in the time of, what did you say, tumult and trepidation, it couldn't possibly be more the opposite. You have the Depression in this country, you have the Spanish Civil War, you have the rise of Hitler, none of which are good places for people to think about spending a lot of money making architecture. You do find, however, an amazing amount of icons, as you said, so it's just a sort of fascinating thing that maybe it just separates the good from the bad, and the best rises to the top. And there are very few but very, very incredible things. Now, in this country, you could imagine there, for instance, all of the public works that Roosevelt's programs, or things like the Rockefellers, who put people to work in New York. And I think, actually, we started with I think these are not quite in the right order, but we can start with that. Yeah, I'll go back to that. In Europe, you have the Bauhaus. Now, this is maybe cheating a little, because the building was built in 1928. But the Bauhaus was flourishing in the early 30s until Hitler closed it down, and all of those great artists and architects and teachers fled mostly to this country, to our great benefit. But this building does represent the kind of epitome of the international style, industrialized, highly complex, super new wave materials, steel, reinforced concrete, glass used in the best technology you could find. But that's a 20s, that's a 1920s thing. The great show at MoMA, the international style, introducing it to this country, really is a show of architecture of the late 20s, not the 30s. The Depression kind of killed all that off, and you find architects doing things like making dollhouses to stay alive, not making buildings. So then you have other great public works, like Rockefeller Center, I think, which remain some of the greatest buildings in Manhattan. People have been trying for 50, 60, 100 years almost to top a building like that, or the next one. This is an ultimate piece of, probably the most highly regarded piece of urban design, 20th century urban design in the world. And and it put a lot of architects to work, a lot of famous architects, Wallace Harrison, Raymond Loewy, on and on and on, and was really the beginning of a series of buildings that then went into things like the UN that started a tradition of great architecture and urban design, all because it's basically a public works project by the Rockefellers to put people to work. And the next slide, the Empire State Building, I would argue still the greatest skyscraper in New York City. And it is known, it was built in 1 year, again, to put people to work. It was called the Empty State Building for many, many years because it was just that, empty. Anyway, I think, can anyone imagine a more iconic building than this building that represents the 20th century? I can't. So it's pretty amazing. But then you have a few other interesting cross currents here, or eddies in the current. Another is the private house. Now, certainly people have always built private houses, and there are people who do have buckets of money to do that, and are probably capitalists or something in some way connected. So you have, again, a couple unbelievable, iconic houses. One I don't have a picture of here is Fallingwater, obviously the greatest house in America of the 20th century. That built for an industrialist from Pittsburgh, Mr. Kaufman. And Frank Lloyd Wright at that point was an old man. I guess he was on his 4th or 5th career at that point. I mean, he dated he was born just after the Civil War. But that building is still regarded as one of the greatest houses of all time, not just of the 20th century. So, too bad I don't have a picture of it. Anyway, then you can go to Europe, to a few other ones. This is perhaps lesser known, but this is the greatest house by Alvar Aalto ever built, the Villa Mairea, which is outside of Helsinki. It was built for the great industrialist Harry Gulliksen, who, all of you who have Aalto stools, that was his company, Artek, that built all of those Aalto stools. An icon of modernist architecture from the mid-30s. Again, insulated from all that's going on in the world because you have a capitalist building something very, very special and very, very, very refined with a great, great architect. The next one, I think has been called the most beautiful house in the world, the Casa Malaparte on Capri, which was built for Gurzio Malaparte, the journalist and writer and friend of Mussolini, by the great fascist architect Libera. Anybody seen the Godard movie, Contempt? This house is in that movie. It's with Brigitte Bardot on the terrace. Anyway, you could not find a more iconic representation of rationalist architecture than that building, I don't think. In Italy, you also find there is architecture in the service of a government agenda, namely fascism, and there's a lot of great fascist architecture and great, you can think of the train stations in Venice and Florence and Rome, the Casa del Fascio, I think we have one more picture there in Como. So that's a whole agenda, political agenda of, that happens to have produced some incredibly important architecture in the service of something not so, wonderful by any means. All these architects were taken in. I believe the first phrase was fascism is an open book. That was their idea in the beginning. They all became obviously rather disillusioned after that. But so that they do represent a string of amazing buildings, but there is no flowering and great movement like in the 20s or like in the 50s or that you could find. But there are some amazing icons, so a fascinating theory.
Do you regard these as conservative buildings from the point of view of the 20s or not?
No, not at all. I wouldn't say so. I mean, these buildings were among the most radical things of their time, and they were, these fascist buildings in particular. It's very interesting to see that Mussolini had a real agenda, a modernist agenda. He actually, his idea was to recreate ancient Rome, but he was doing it with contemporary architecture. which is the opposite of what Hitler was trying to do with Speer, who had kind of neoclassical architecture to try and literally recreate it. Very, very divergent notion of
So once again, that idea of retrospection and innovation balancing in different ways depending on the place, the time, and the artist, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Fabulous.
I think it's unbelievable. I'm pretty blown away. I think that my question was about the feeling, because both governments, the fascist government and even the US government, were reacting to a feeling in the populace. And maybe there was, I don't know, this isn't the real complete thought, but maybe adversity forces some issues. You know, what is our role? You know, what are we supposed to make others feel? You know, how are we supposed to inspire people? And are there some themes in these icons that you?
Well, these actually, I think there's one more slide, isn't there? Of the, you know, yeah. This is an incredible thing, I think. I mean, the most beautiful bridge in the world. Maybe some might say the Brooklyn Bridge, but I'd vote for that. And if you've ever looked at its details closely, they are absolutely high-style WPA, you know, real Art Deco details, all of them. So it's really beautiful. And that again it's the public works. It's trying to create jobs and put lots of people to work. I guess I don't have, like, the Hoover Dam would probably fall in the same zone, right? Or all of those WPA post offices, all high style, all. So there is a style attached to an agenda there, absolutely. But it wouldn't exist yet for a government program.
Why don't we turn to Heidi to talk about the fine arts?
Great. So a couple of things that I think would be interesting. I do have a lot of iconic artists, and interestingly, some iconic works. Some of these artists, their iconic works were in the 20s, but I didn't cheat at all. All my images are from the 1930s. And you know, I think this idea of artist as communicator and as kind of conduit for contemporary consciousness is something that I really wanted to pick up on. And I thought that might be a way, as we start to dialogue, to bring it to the contemporary topic as well. But I have my artists grouped in 5 sort of categories to give insight, and I focus primarily on Europe and the US because I thought that's sort of what we were talking about. So just as a disclaimer, this is a totally Western view. But if we look at the first slide, the first categories that I wanted to talk about, and I wanted to reference works that I knew you guys were thinking about as well, is the influence of the wars and the political response and sort of the angst and agita that a lot of these artists were feeling and how that manifests itself in the work. So of course, this is Picasso's Guernica. All the titles, the names of the artists and the dates are up there, so I won't repeat them, but you know, it really is still looked at as one of the most galvanizing political statements ever depicted. There's the saturation bombing of the Nazis by the box city Guernica that killed 2,500 innocent civilians. You know, when we think about the killing of innocent civilians, you know, in our own time, we're looking now at the 10th anniversary of September 11th, and it just gives us a perspective of, you know, what's happened and these different incidents that unfortunately continue cyclically throughout our history and our culture, and then how do artists respond to that. So this is really an embodiment of the human brutality that's associated with war. And you know, I mean, you see people screaming, you see the animals, you see a sort of eye-like sun, you know, that's perhaps a reference to a, you know, higher power looking down, maybe looking away, somehow allowing this to happen. So, you know, it's really clear that this is a very emotional response. There's no way to look at it without eliciting a feeling. So Gil, your question about, you know, what is the intentionality of these architectural spaces to connote emotion? I mean, that's what artists are so good at. They express their own, but they also create an icon for other people to put their feelings into that space or that visual plane as well. The next work. This is a technique that was very popular in the 1930s of photo montage. Again, the accumulation of various things into each other and compiling upon themselves. And again, a sort of nice metaphor for what was happening in contemporary society. A lot of different fractions coming together, colliding with each other, causing different responses, emotional, intellectual, philosophical. John Heartfield spent most of his career fighting Hitler and the Nazis' rise through these really novel techniques to image making. This was really a moment in which art became a very powerful tool for political satire. And this work in particular was protesting hunger, loss, suffering, and the anti-Semitism that was really engulfing Germany at the time. So here you start to see art as a social critique and a tool of empowerment. And this is something that we still see now. How can art express these complex ideas, these complex political perspectives in a way that maybe is non-didactic because it is visual? The next one. So this is a work by Arshile Gorky, again, iconic artist, less iconic work, but it's really a visual representation, again, of human angst, of longing, the tortured inner soul. He's an expressionist painter who handled paint really with very deep emotion and passion, using vivid colors to define and convey his subjects in a raw, emotional, very direct mode. This is really a redefinition of the still life, which was very popular in the early 20th century, towards a more modern expressionistic mode. It's less rigid, but it's really incredibly direct and visceral. Of course, later his work moved into more abstract expressionist styles. But here you get a really iconic image, the artist and his mother, which is something that artists have been doing, historically. But here it's a very flat modernist style. So, and he was specifically here referencing the World War II persecution of Armenian people and specifically the loss of his own mother. Next. And then this work by Max Beckmann, again, expressionism, very deeply personal work made in response to the rise of Hitler. It's speaking about the harsh treatment, brutality, inner angst, the struggle of the human spirit to fight and to come through. And we can look at art in a lot of different ways in terms of offering a transcendent experience. We call it the aesthetic experience in my business, which is when you stand in front of an object and you're transported really to another time or space or plane, and you can't prescribe it, you can't mandate it, but sometimes it happens. And so the artists are, of course, expressing their own ideas, but offering these vehicles for the viewer to then sometimes be taken to this other place. Next one. So the next category that I would talk about for the 30s is the rise of utopist or utopian theories based on abstraction. And so looking at abstraction as a way of talking about the more universal themes. Malevich, of course, is associated with the suprematist art movement, which was central to modernism in Russian culture. He's really talking about a constructed utopia, a new world, a new state in Russia. It's actually very hopeful. There's the idea of suprematism as a pure art, a place away from the representation of objects and things. And maybe this gets back to your idea of this period of time as being, of course, a time of devastation, but sometimes within devastation there's possibility of something new. Again, transcendence, hope, and so that's what I would say is embodied here. The next image, very iconic, Mondrian, and again, it's really connecting to a sort of true intellectual freedom. Out of devastation comes opportunity, the expression of this pure abstract style, infinite shapes, lines, areas, trying to get to the essentialness of things. So if everything's fallen apart, then what is the essential nature? What can we go back to? What takes us forward? So progress through reduction. Next image. I felt that I had to include this work because I know that Gail's mentioned it a couple times. Of course, the 30s is the rise of surrealism. And the persistence of memory is, of course, one of the most iconic works of the 20th century. And what I would say about this is that, you know, it's insight into the subconscious, but it's also about, you know, what we see as individuals, and that's one of my other themes to kind of come back to, is that when things get broken apart, then you do get the cult of the individual again, and Dolly's work is really characterized by the idea that, you know, people see different things in it, and the start of the idea that there is no one specific meaning. So, you know, once you have the development of art for art's sake, and then moving into the 30s, there's so much openness, and that's why you see so many different stylistic periods happening simultaneously in the same historical moment. Next. So then, looking at America, of course, we have, to use Graeme's term, populist Americana ethnic trends of the Depression era. You know, these works, of course, commissioned by the WPA, were intending to communicate just the devastation of American society. And, you know, the picture that's taken right after this one is actually the mother feeding her child. And that's not the one that became an icon. This is the one. And so you know, of course, looking back historically, that there is some propaganda, you know, certainly in the 30s, you know, with some of this work about what was the message that we were trying to communicate. Next one. So another, you know, Alabama tenant farmer's wife. So set against the very simple background, what you focus on instead is the patterning in her dress, the kind of line of her mouth, the way that she looks directly at the camera, sort of daring the viewer to make a judgment. So there's an incredible pride in this work. Again, this kind of human spirit, not willing to step back, you know, despite adversity. Again, that I would say is characterized by the art created at this time. Next one. So Grant Wood, American Gothic from 1930. You know, an example of a regional movement which really sort of aggressively opposed what was happening in Europe at the time, which was, you know, much more sort of universal, and instead, you know, looking here to a really representational style, really direct rendering. And I mean, if you look at the fact that these works were being made at the same time, you know, this and the Mondrian, you see, you know, the incredible diversity of what was happening. So, but there is in here a little bit of satire about intolerance and rigidity that rural life represented. And so there's the kind of championing of that own kind of individual or personal perspective. Next one. And then my last one would be the idea of artist as individual, which is something we still see today. An artist as innovator, and so this is obviously Marcel Duchamp. The idea here is that art can be made out of anything, art can be portable, and this is the miniature versions of all his own iconic works brought into one suitcase. The idea of transience, that now we're sort of a culture of movement. You know, you may have grown up in a place that doesn't exist anymore, or in a country that doesn't want you, and so you have to kind of flee. But you can take with you the things that are most important to you, which would be your own personal icons, or the elements of creativity. So, and then the next is Alfred Stieglitz. Great. The images that you showed of Rockefeller Center and the Empire State Building were probably taken about this same time. But using the camera not just as a reflection of reality, but with a really individualistic perspective, sometimes at an angle, or from below or from above, but the idea that, you know, the camera can be used to communicate something more than pure reality, but a very specifically skewed perspective as well. And then the last image takes us back to Europe and Rodchenko. And so a similar idea, you're standing below, you get this girl seen against a completely abstract background, which is of course the sky, but it's disappeared. So instead you focus on the light and dark, the contrast in her face. Again, her shirt sort of disappears, and using the camera as something more than just a vehicle to communicate, but something to allow for personal expression.
Wonderful. So. Thank you, Heidi. So we've seen a panorama of the arts in fast motion, and we've gone from music to architecture and then to the fine arts. And there's so much more behind it that we can't talk about. But I'm wondering, just to start our discussion, how the musicians feel about these non-musical works, as it were, if I could say that. Do they speak to your feelings or impressions about Violin Concerti of the 30s or other masterpieces from that time?
Well, if we might hear some of Benjamin Britten's Violin Concerto, because Benjamin Britten was a pacifist, but deeply, deeply concerned about fascism, and he wrote the Violin Concerto at the time of Guernica. And now I'm taking your thought, but that there is something very congruent in his response to the Spanish Civil War in the Violin Concerto, which was one of his most deeply personal pieces, I would say, and then Picasso. So this passage is, I think, the Passacaglia.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh, let me,
Do you want to say anything about playing it?
I mean, for me, this passage, it's hard for me to separate it from that image of, the woman screaming in Guernica. It's this high-pitched violin over this very ancient, old, in the bass, this Passacaglia, this old primitive dance, and I think the music speaks for itself. Grows and becomes this massive structure of 13 minutes. No.
that's just the beginning.
But going to Heidi's point, Benjamin Britten absolutely believed as an artist he needed to speak to his time, and he needed to speak about the issues of his time, and being truly a pacifist, he thought, how then do we resist, if not through war, and these pieces written in the late 30s were about that.
So how do you contrast that with, I'm fascinated by that, in particular the example I used of fascist architecture, because these guys who were, I think they are universally admired by all architects, because they were really very, very good architects, but they were doing something in the service of something very evil, and they subverted, so they took all the rules of the international style, the industrial sash window, the column-free plan, the reinforced concrete and steel technology, long spans, minimal details, and subverted them into a whole nother language that was supposed to express this idea of fascism, as an open book, as being the way of the future, as being the only true way that architecture should be in the future. I mean, that's a really...
Did those architects follow through? I don't know the story. If they followed
They
through
all-
with the fascist project
They
through
all,
to
one
its-
by one, became disillusioned. They got drafted. Several of them got killed in the war, or disappeared, or fell out of favor, or because one by one they thought, hey, wait a minute, what are we doing here? Because I guess they wanted to believe they could make architecture serve that agenda, because it seemed the thing to do, and it's so. The opposite being what I mentioned of the Hitler's agenda and his megalomaniacal architecture ideas of Speer making ancient Rome at 10 times the scale, and squashing any modernist idea, and chasing away all of the Bauhaus guys and the Mies van der Rohe, Gropius, all those great painters.
Well, I think it speaks to the idea of the power of architecture, that the fascist governments were looking to architects to create these icons to express their goals and intentions.
This is the agenda.
So,
here it is.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so the idea that they needed to create a new style, new in quotes, which was actually a slightly reactionary style, as a way of moving forward. So they were looking to the past to move forward, but as a way of trying to negate what was happening already. So, I mean, a similar thing happened, in art to some extent as well, where, the government was commissioning artists to make works that spoke to power because they understood that there's a huge power of visual representation. And so, I can't speak to it for music, but it was as if the creative spirit was co-opted, by the fascists in order to express their intentions in a way that was really accessible, because visual culture is accessible. We all see things. How we know them is interpretation, but we can't help but look.
There's a great book, I don't know if you ever read, called The Edifice Complex, which is by Dehan Sujic, the London Design Museum guy. And its theory is all about the incredible predilection of architects to work for whoever is going to build them that big edifice, no matter what their agenda. So you've got, Hitler and Speer, you've got Mussolini and Libera or Terragni, you have Mao, and all of his, all the maniacal architecture that came from there. There are many, many examples. Napoleon. Every despot had his architect. And none of them had to. Rem Koolhaas just did the organ of the state in China. The great television and radio mouthpiece of the party. So it's still going on, I guess. Though.
One thing that strikes me from all the material that we've been listening to, looking at, discussing, is the very important role of abstraction as part of the equation. Abstraction being the unfamiliar, often the stripped down, aggressively new and individual. And I think when we look at this art and music from our perspective in 2011, that abstraction is a key feature, balanced against traditionally received modes of perception and creativity from the past. And I just wonder, how do people relate to abstraction? How do you feel about abstraction? And how do you feel abstraction? And I think it depends a lot on what you bring to it, what you bring to looking at the Casa Malaparte. That experience is profoundly subjective. I think it's dangerous to talk about the spirit of an age. You always miss so much and violate so much of what's going on. But one thing that seems pretty focal is the function of abstraction as part of the vocabulary. Do you guys agree with that idea, or what do you think?
Curiously, Stravinsky began saying in the 30s that music expressed nothing, had no meaning, and that he wished there to be no emotion associated, emotion of expression with the performance of his music. Now, he was a big liar. And, half the things Stravinsky,
smart liar.
Yeah, very smart, but half the things he said, I think, were provocations.
Mystification.
But that's something that he said a lot. And if we listen to all these concertos, the Stravinsky is sort of an outlier among them. To my mind, it's so cheerful, and yet was written right in the middle of all this stuff.
And yet it has an abstracting element. It has an element of defamiliarization, which is very witty and pointed.
Yeah, it's very abstract, and the movements have titles which are derived from ancient, at that point, ancient music.
So let's listen to just a little bit of the Stravinsky then, okay?
One thing that's happening here, I think we decided not to talk about this, but is the influence of jazz on classical composers, which was hugely important in the 30s. And you definitely hear Stravinsky's version of a highly abstracted and refined jazz element. But basically, I think times were good in Hollywood, evidently. So. Yeah.
But this Stravinsky, it sounds like something, an 18th century concerto where something terribly wrong has happened to your mind or your ears.
It is. It's neoclassicist with tongue-in-cheek, right? I mean, it's like you say, it's abstraction put into a classical form. This movement is called toccata, and all the four movements have Baroque titles. Yeah. I think Stravinsky said he was influenced by Bach, but there's a lot of Baroque and concertante style. I think it's interesting, as you mentioned, that of these works, Stravinsky and Milhaud are by far the cheeriest, all written in Paris before the war, which I think is ironic. But the other thing that's interesting about this piece, which is a very famous story, is that the opening chord is a new chord. You know, it was very celebrated, and as you say, presented itself as an innovation. The story was that Stravinsky sat at a restaurant with the violinist Samuel Dushkin, and he wrote this chord on a napkin for him, and he said, "Can you play this?" And the chord contained the interval of an 11th. So the violinist would have to stretch his pinky, you know, to reach an 11th. And Dushkin said, "No, this is not playable." And then he took it to his room. And you know, the thing about the violin is the distances between notes become smaller the higher up you go. And it turns out this particular chord was playable, which I suspect Stravinsky knew all along. And Dushkin wrote back to say, actually, it is playable. And I don't know, to my mind, that sounds a little bit, Concerto's 1931, it sounds a little bit like, you know, the Empire State Building. You know, yeah, I can push a little bit higher than the Chrysler Building. We are in a new world, and we can do things that are different. The other parallel that I see is, and this is just in my own head and probably wrong, but to me this neoclassicism always reminds me of Picasso. And there's something about the forms are clear, they're recognizable, but any symmetry you would expect, any predictability is gone. You know, it's all based on asymmetrical lines, asymmetrical meters. And that's all I've got.
We're going to run out of time. I don't know, we started quite a bit late. I'm not sure if we can go a little bit late. But why don't we open it up to questions for a minute or two and see what kind of time we can have.
Some of you referred to fascism and Nazism in the 30s. One of the most prolific conductors here is James Conlon, and he's taken a twist toward rediscovering some of the Jewish voices that were stilled by the Nazis in the 30s. And it's still coming out more and more. Do you have any comments on those?
Well, we will perform actually one of those forbidden works. I forget the date. But Karl Amadeus Hartmann was not Jewish, but he was an anti-Nazi composer who lived in Munich during the war. And actually, in a way, he was the only composer who kept writing music with anti-Nazi statements in it. And the Violin Concerto is maybe his most famous work. It's also the one work in the collection in which we know from his writings, we have a letter in which he says, this piece is a reflection of our times. It contains a Czech anthem in it. It was written as a reaction to the invasion of Czechoslovakia. And yeah, I guess again, an incredible man, and James Conlon has actually recorded this in his collection of Entartete Musik. The concerto ended up being smuggled out of Munich to Switzerland, where it received its premiere. And I think it wasn't really until the 60s that it began to be played by violinists like Tibor Varga.
We have time for a couple of more questions. I think there's a question over there, if we can get the microphone over there.
Thank you. A question about 1930s microtonal and atonal music. You mentioned Schoenberg. Where has it gone? Why did it not flourish? And certainly for Alan, as the director of one of the world's leading music festivals, when you make decisions about what to put on a program, Where does the choice of microtonal and atonal music lie in your mind, and why might you or might you not choose to put it on a program? Thank you.
Wow, okay. I can see why you put them together, but in my mind, they're very different. Again, something that we talked about in the 30s and just decided was too big is Harry Partch and John Cage and the real avant-garde in America that was definitely exploring alternate tunings, alternate instruments, creating new kinds of instruments. And it is, I think it's music still waiting to be understood. One thing, it's such a great question, but such a huge question. Largely, this is a generalization, but largely the music of, say, Mahler was missing in the 30s, and it represented that discredited other thing that was happening. And then in the 50s and especially 60s, major musical institutions and conductors begin rediscovering this music that's 50, 60 years old. And I'll give you a preview that next summer our theme is Made in America, will be American music, and we will be looking at Harry Partch and these alternative instruments, and we'll be looking at John Cage and what the to avant-garde was like in those years. But it is hard in a festival context to do large, complex works that people won't like. And
Why don't they like them? Why not?
That's a
We'll
question
save
you
that
could
for the
actually-
next session.
you could-
We
you
have
could
time for just one more question, and we have to stop in just a minute. Yes.
Your question on abstraction, I'm not sure if I know what you meant. Is it because we're so used to abstraction?
You mean what is abstraction?
No, I know what it is, but I didn't understand your question or your comment on abstraction. We're so used to abstraction.
Well, I think it depends on the people, their relationship to abstraction. My idea was that the 30s does have this strong investment in abstraction. And that is very interesting today. I mean, I see the 1930s as being on the far side of the divide of World War II, which changed everything. And so the 30s is far away in that way. And it allows us to discover the 30s. There's a lot about the 30s that is not adequately considered or thought. And I think its engagement with abstraction in a context that preserves a lot of traditional ways of thinking and acting creatively is particularly fascinating and is a harvest for the future. That's my basic thought. I'm afraid I had the last word. I shouldn't have. But we must vacate the premises. So thank you very much for coming to this session. Thank you, panelists, for a wonderful discussion.